So we've been talking ways of passing through this difficult liminal time where the old system and ways are crumbling, but where human life will head next remains a big unknown. We've also covered quite a bit in regards to both how current left-brained, materialist, disembodied ways of going about things can no longer save us. They can no longer serve us. And we've touched on the kind of moral values and the embodied emergent process required to move into this what comes next that I've talked about several times. But I've had the sense over the last couple of weeks that we need to get more of an embodied feel for how we actually do, or more accurately, be this transition that's ahead, both individually and as a collective. Now, to be honest, I continue to struggle with getting the embodied emergent process that keeps coming up in this conversation. And I think that's because it requires dropping the cognitive left-brained approach that's dominated for the past several hundred years, and that frankly I've been wedded to because it served me and it's got me ahead, quote unquote. And it requires going into what feels like woo-woo territory, at least to the cognitive heavy neoliberal mind. But here's the thing, each time I do open to this woo-woo or embodied or nature entangled wisdoms that are surfacing more and more, something in me gets it, or at least my body does, my nervous system does. And really, that's because this so-called woo-woo wisdom is what we did. It's what we've always done. It's who we are. It's who we were for hundreds of thousands of years until relatively recently. It's what actually kept us alive. We are the ancestors of those humans who lived out these very wisdoms. So I've invited John Seed to take us there again, to touch that knowingness from yet another angle. John Seed is an OG, an original Australian rainforest activist, and one of the foundational figures of the Deep Ecology movement, which spawned the bioregional movement and the food cooperatives movement. Now, John collaborated with the late Joanna Macy for many decades, writing a book with her called How to Think Like a Mountain, and developing a re-earthing technique called Council of All Beings. John's work via his Rainforest Information Centre has seen rainforests around the world get various forms of protection status, including World Heritage listings. And he famously managed to pressure Burger King in the US to cease sourcing soybeans by clear-cutting Costa Rica's misty woods. Now, John is now in his early 80s, but he continues to spread his deep ecology message, which says we can't save the world. Instead, we are the world. In this chat, I asked John to take us to that place that I mentioned, that weird woo-woo but familiar embodied place that seems to make sense. And it seems to me and many others to provide a way of being in this, a reorientation that will enable the emergence. He applies his wisdoms specifically to the ecological crisis, but really it applies to all the crises because really it's all the one crisis. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hey, John Seed, welcome to Wild.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
It's lovely to have you here. It's wonderful because a reader or a listener in my community actually reached out, and I think she does some work with you and was very enthusiastic about having you here. So her wish is my command. John, I was keen actually to speak to you regardless and get you to explain your work, but particularly could we kick off perhaps by you explaining what deep ecology actually is?
So deep ecology, the term was coined by the late Arne Næss, who was the professor of philosophy at Oslo University. And according to him, underlying all of the symptoms of the environmental crisis, we find the illusion of separation between human beings and the rest of the natural world. And he didn't mean anything particularly mysterious by illusion of separation, and anyone who wants to demonstrate the reality of it irrevocably to themselves just needs to hold their breath for 5 or 10 minutes while they think about it. And so we're just talking about the fact that we are inextricably embedded in the natural world, that it is passing through us at all times, that the nature out there and the nature in here are one and the same. And he said that this illusion of separation was a result of anthropocentrism or human-centeredness, the idea that human beings are the center of everything. So to this anthropocentric mindset, we are the crown of creation. We are the measure of all beings. The world consists of human beings on the one hand and resources for human beings on the other. Nothing has intrinsic value except humans. Other things may have instrumental value if they're valuable to us. So this pernicious, self-centered idea, Ness claimed, stretches back thousands of years, at least as far as the Old Testament, where we learn that man is to subdue and dominate nature, and nature is to be in fear and trembling of us. And as a result, he said, the anthropocentrism corrupts everything that we create, every institution of our society, our language, our soul. And for that reason, he said, we're not going to be able to think our way out of the mess. He said that ecological ideas won't save us. What we need is ecological identity or ecological self.
Yeah, which is a really big switch. And I think it's particularly significant for anybody in the climate movement, because I think, having been a climate activist for many years, we have this sense that we can solve the climate crisis with, fixes and ideas and so on. And even the language of I, as a separate person, can solve the climate, can save the planet, feeds into exactly what you're talking about.
Yes, that's so. And he said that what we need are community therapies to heal that illusion of separation. In other words, it's not something that we can solve by ourselves, and that it's by creating a culture of reconnection together that we find the path forward. And this, I think, relates to the kind of islands of coherence or islands of sanity that Ilya Prigogine called for, and that he says that, in all of the chaos, these islands of sanity emerge, and these community therapies of what Joanna Macy, another of my teachers, called waking up together.
Yep. There's a sense that's coming through on this podcast, and it's been coming through for quite some time. I interviewed Meg Wheatley a long time ago, so 2 years or so ago, maybe 3 years ago. And she uses this term, the islands of sanity. And I think it's something that we're all starting to get a feel for. But I think there was a kind of a cognitive element to that. But what you're saying is we're coming together principally to reconnect with nature. And to do that, you're saying we need to do that with other humans as well. I mean, just going back to the climate activism piece, because I think there's a lot of climate activists who listen to this podcast, there's a real sense that we haven't been able to make headway, that there's all this denial and ignorance. And you say that it's not about a lack of ideas, or it's not about a lack of awareness out there. It really is about identity. It's about the fact that we do see ourselves as overlords, sitting above nature. So what I'd love to ask you is, what would it actually look like if we instead experienced ourselves sort of as, and to quote you, as the earth defending itself? If we saw what we're doing as not saving the planet, but actually saving ourselves, what does that actually look like when you work with people in your workshops and when they start to get this kind of way of thinking, this deep ecology way of thinking?
Well, the way of thinking, as I said, stemmed from Arnie Ness's work, but it was only 4 or 5 years after I discovered this that I met my next teacher, Joanna Macy, who provided the missing link between the ideas of deep ecology, which, as Arnie Ness pointed out, are of no use without turning into identity. And she had the I would say the psychological tools, the spiritual tools that allow the ideas of deep ecology to turn into the ecological identity that Arnie Ness was calling for. And Joanna was working with, when I met her in 1985, she was doing a workshop called Despair and Empowerment. And the key was that the answer was hidden in all of the emotions and feelings that we've been taught to suppress and taught to fear. And that she showed us that by creating a safe container where we could express and share with each other and hear all of the anguish and rage and dread and terror that underlies all of us who are looking closely at the world, but that there's never the invitation, there's never the opportunity to honour these feelings and to put them in the forefront. And so it's after having done this that the sense of ecological identity begins to emerge. So what it looks like is in the experiential deep ecology workshops, what Joanna Macy called the work that reconnects. We get together, do some preparation, and then start on Friday night. On Saturday morning, we get in a circle and create this safe container and invite these feelings. There's a particular ceremony that we use, but that's one of many different ways of doing this. And it's like totally astounding because there's nothing in our culture that prepares us for sitting for 90 minutes or more and just listening to one person after another talking from the bottom of their heart, and each sharing builds on the last. So by the time that we reach the end, the space is saturated with these feelings, and then we don't then move into another circle about empowerment. What we do is create a lot of space and allow everyone to see that something emerges at that point spontaneously. It got nothing up my sleeve. It's not something that the facilitator is producing, but it's just that when these feelings are honestly met and addressed, a total shift of consciousness and identity begins to take place. And what that looks like, you have to see it. You know, you can't exactly put it into words, the finger pointing at the moon and all of that. But what it looks like is that the sense of paralysis that has, afflicted most people to a large extent, the sense of helplessness and hopelessness and what can one person do anyway, and it's all too late, and these kind of feelings, they evaporate and they're replaced by this exuberance and this upliftment, and all of a sudden this sense of celebration begins to emerge, and then we do processes that allow that to express itself and allow that to metabolize, But the actual experience arises spontaneously as a result of honestly experiencing our own feelings and the feelings of our people about what's happening to our world.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, the kinds of emotions that you work with in that setting are things like despair and rage and grief, which I think are precisely what a lot of people are feeling at the moment being in this world, because there's so much to be feeling about right now. And you refer to it as necessary intelligence. These emotions are necessary intelligences that can guide us. But really what you're saying is the work that you and Joanna did for many decades before she passed last year is really just getting people into a room and feeling and expressing and staying with these emotions rather than running away from it. And that you don't have to do too much more. I almost say the same about being in nature. People say to me, so how does hiking or being in nature work? And I'm like, you don't have to worry about it. Just get into nature and it does its thing. And it sounds like you're saying the same thing about being in a room with a bunch of people, literally just talking about your emotions. And then what emerges is something empowered by virtue of just releasing and talking through those emotions. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. But I would just say that if you're able to combine that with being in nature rather than being in a room, it's even more splendid. Yeah,
exactly.
But the piece that's been coming really strongly for me this year, I guess, is that these feelings are an important part of our intelligence. That when we look back upon our 4,000 million year history since the first cell of life on Earth, we can say for certain that every single one of our ancestors during that whole stretch of time was intelligent enough to reach the age of reproducing itself before it was consumed, without exception. And 99.999999% of that intelligence preceded cognition. So what we call feelings are what remains in us of an ancient intelligence that stood us in very good stead and that was selected for in every single generation. Any mammal running towards something, wagging its tail when it should be running away as fast as it can, doesn't leave its genes in the gene pool. And so just the ability to know what to do, so our ideas are very beautiful, the cognition is great, but without the passion of these feelings to support it, it's sterile, and that's where the helplessness and the paralysis comes from. So that as soon as the feelings have done their work is to inform us and to make sure, and to inform our people, to inform us and to make sure that we let everybody know about the danger. And that's what this ceremony allows. And by the end of that, the work is done, and there's no reason for those feelings to be tugging it away at our happiness. There's no reason for these feelings. The work is done. We've understood. We've heard the news. We're ready to respond in whatever way we're going to do so. And now celebration is possible.
Yeah, so what you're saying is this is not alien or sort of strange or an alternative practice. We are, in fact, the ancestors of those who were able to process these feelings and use it's what you call this necessary intelligence, wisely. And we're just doing a return to that way of being. And I find it interesting that it's this time in history when we're faced with so many threats that we're waking up again to this way of being, because in fact it's this way of being that did save us over and over again from all kinds of threats throughout history. And I wonder, John, if you have a take on this. I mean, I'm watching, sort of neurodivergence, amongst children, amongst adults, it's spiking. But I would say in general, there's a sensitivity that has emerged over the last few years where people are feeling all kinds of things at a level that, probably didn't exist 10 years ago even. Do you feel that that's all part of this, that it's surfacing because we're feeling the peril, we're feeling that we're really at a turning point?
I hadn't thought of it exactly like that, Sarah, but it is certainly that resonates a lot. And that, when I look back on the scientific story of evolution, the evolution of the cosmos, the evolution of the periodic table of elements. In the beginning, there was nothing but hydrogen and helium, and then in the death throes of stars, the other elements were born, and so on. And then look at the history of life. It's just full of what we politely call emergent properties. There was nothing about the Big Bang that would have suggested quarks and gluons, nothing about those that would have suggested atoms, nothing about molecules that would have suggested life, and nothing about life that would have predicted consciousness. And I can't help but feel, and it may just be wishful thinking, that there's something like that pulling at me from the future. I feel echoes of the future in that. So I guess my particular take on this is that I've been doing exactly the same work with Deep Ecology for 40 years now, where I've continued with the activism that led me there. I was arrested at the Rising Tide protest last year, and I'm awaiting court, and so on. So I'm totally into all of that. But the work I'm doing is exactly the same. But for 30 years, the work was very, very popular with hippies, pagans, and witches, and then slowly more ordinary people have been coming in until now there's professors co-facilitating beside me, professors of environmental management, and members of parliament who are coming to the workshops. So, and lots and lots of young people. I zoomed into a Melbourne workshop that I was facilitating with 3 friends yesterday, and of the 30 people there, I think 25 were under 30. And so it's very, very exciting to see this happening. And I do feel that the times are so compelling that it's difficult. It's getting more and more difficult to just bury your head in the sand.
Yeah, and to suppress those feelings that are a necessary intelligence. You focus on numbness and denial quite a bit, and I think activists, all of us, look around and get quite concerned about that particular response that is quite prevalent amongst people when faced with, what's going on in the world. But your take on it is that it's a response to this disconnect that we feel. So we have this instinctual sense of connection, these ecological feelings that are part of our humanness. But then we've got this social conditioning that comes in over the top and suppresses them. So, feelings of grief or despair or rage, it comes in over the top and suppresses them. And so then a numbness or a sense of denial is the reaction, is the outcome of that suppression. So it's really quite interesting. What many of us are seen as ignorance or a desire just to put your head in the sand is actually a defense against the suppression of these deep ecologically connected feelings. And that really shifts the dial on things. I really wanted to sort of tease that out a bit because I think it's worth remembering that, numbness and denial are not the first order emotions going on here.
When we look back at our evolutionary heritage, and we look back at the role of these feelings in being, before cognition, these feelings were all we had. We call it intuition, call it instinct, doesn't matter what you call it. What we call feelings is what remains of that intelligence that allowed our ancestors to know when to fight and when to run away, when to freeze, what was safe, what was dangerous, all of these things. And so these feelings are pushing up with all of the force of natural selection behind them, and completely unconsciously we're pushing back down with all of the forces of fear and social conditioning. If I was to fully experience the depth of the anguish that must be there, given what I know about what's happening to my world, surely I would be crushed by this. I would become hopelessly depressed. Maybe I'd commit suicide. Wrong. They're just feelings. We come together in the circle. We create the container that makes it safe. Something that Joanna Macy taught and that we've worked with for 40 years. I've never lost anyone. It's totally safe to do. But it takes quite a leap of faith to dare to go there, because we've been taught to fear these things. And so the suppression to push down that naturally selected force must be equal and opposite. And so my sense is that sense of numbness and paralysis is that most of our life force is being wasted in this futile struggle between instinctual forces and suppression, social suppression.
You've described the process somewhere, I read it when I was researching for this interview, as being like falling in love outwards. What do you mean by that?
Well, I didn't invent that phrase. I think that was, I'm going to guess that it was the American poet Robinson Jeffers, who was one of the ancestors of the Deep Ecology movement. Maybe I can explain it with a line from one of Jeffers' poems where he says, surely it's time for us to allow the diamond within to reach out and touch the diamond without, stretching our humanity thin between the invulnerable diamonds. And so the diamond within is, what spiritual people recognize. And they think that people who are, many such people think that people who are activists are just deluded. They're falling for an illusion that the real truth is our spiritual nature, and that everything else is Maya, is, just distracting us from that, And so meditation means not getting distracted by the world, And then there are the activists who just think that all that spiritual stuff is just weak-mindedness and everything is
Woo-woo.
reduced to the, woo-woo. And I think deep ecology, I think of it as true woo-woo. That, that you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what Robinson Jeffers is saying is that we hold both the importance of our own spiritual reality, that our identity, our ecological identity, all that kind of a thing. And we don't reduce everything to that, and we don't reduce everything to the outer, but we hold both of those things and allow the tension between them to kind of dissolve our ego. And so, the diamond within stretching out to touch the diamond without is the falling in love outwards. Yeah. I'm not sure if I can put it any less poetically.
No, I get it. And it's like, I think so much of what we actually do as humans is a desire to reach outwards, to know the world. And we've done this through, in the last, let's say 250, potentially longer years. It's been a gradual and then a fast sort of transferal into the cognitive left brain way of being, particularly since the industrial period. But so much of that has been about wanting to connect the diamond within, the sense that we belong, with sort of betterment, with reaching out to the world, where we actually do seek that congruence, but we've become too head heavy to actually see when we go off that path. And I like that idea of falling in love but outwards. It negates that egoic, head-centric approach to things. It's interesting because what we're talking about is a lovely process of getting into attunement with nature. But in terms of it being a way of being that can help us navigate what's happening in the world today, and instead of thinking that we're going to save the planet, to use your words, it's about accepting that we're actually defending ourselves. We are the planet, so we're defending ourselves. What are the implications for a deep ecological mindset for our predicament today, where things are in a lot of trouble? Does this mean we just kind of accept it and go down with nature? Or how do we use all of this to activate and use the right kind of activation muscle?
Well, this is... Arnie Ness said that the definition of deep ecology was asking deeper questions. So this is one of those, and I wouldn't dare pretend that I know the answer. However, what's coming to me at the moment is something like this, that part of our ecological identity is the fact that we are, just as we are composed of 1 trillion cells working in unison, working in harmony, that create our bodies, and here we are also part of wider reciprocities, and we are part of the web of life. We are both as a species and as individuals contained within larger wholes. And if we look at wholes within wholes, WHOLES, within wholes, then it seems to me that the entire universe, from the subatomic to the galactic, intergalactic, there's a tremendous sense of order and coherence there, with the only exception that I can see is the human personality and the creations of that personality, the relationships and the institutions that we create. So if we look at our own body, one cell becomes 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and at a certain point, one of them drifts off, and it doesn't know that it's on its way to becoming a liver, and another one drifts off and it doesn't know it's going to become a brain, and the two are going to remain completely related and working together in harmony to create this incredible creature that they're going to be. And so if we can nourish our ecological identity, it's not something we create because it's who we are underneath the tiny veneer of the social, but if we can nourish that, then is it possible that we can allow ourselves to be pulled by our own destiny, or whatever you want to call it, into the particular role that we are needed to play. Do you know? Whatever is the force that's pulling that cell to become the liver and pulling that cell to become the brain, can we surrender to the same force so that humanity also can start to move back into that kind of harmony that everything else seems to be within? You know, that something happened to us when cognition emerged, which I think disrupted that ability to just easily remain part of these wider reciprocities that everything else in the universe seems to be in. So I just, for me, when I don't know what to do next, I will do something like, if I'm in the right conditions and the right, weather, I will bury myself in leaves and feel my body against the earth and remember that I'm part of the earth, and remember that every cell in my body came out of the earth and every cell in my body is returning to the earth, and just put myself in that frame of mind, and then just send out a message to the earth and through the earth to the rest of the universe saying, show me the way forward, and I will know the answer by my enthusiasm. I will trust my next enthusiasm to be your reply. And I can only say that that's worked really well for me, that I feel that like my life has exhibited a kind of a coherence since then, which is to say the second half of my 80 years has been coherent in a way that the first half was not.
So for anyone listening to the way that you've described that, and it's evocative and it really does make sense, because I do think that that is who we are, but is wondering, well, we've really kind of stuffed things up with our cognition, our, left brain dominating ways. So we need to be doing something. We can't just sit back on the lilo, and join the flow of life. We need to be rolling up our sleeves and doing a little more than that. What would you say to that? Where does activism and actually being responsible stewards in this moment fit in?
Well, once again, I can just mainly talk about myself, where the Deep Ecology grew out of my activism. I was a rainforest activist since my awakening in the rainforest at Terania Creek in 1979, which was the first rainforest action not only in Australia but in the world, where people chained themselves to machinery and so on. And I was part of similar actions in Tasmania the following year for the Franklin River blockade, and then up at the Daintree for the tropical rainforests after that. And by then it had become clear that for every forest that was being protected worldwide, and we'd had tremendous success in Australia in those years, national parks in all 3 states, instead of the development and destruction that was planned, worldwide, for every forest protected, 1,000 forests had been destroyed, and there's no way to save the planet one forest at a time. And that's what led me to Deep Ecology, because it felt like a fundamental change in consciousness was going to be needed. None of the technological fixes was going to do it otherwise, and none of the activism was going to do it. However, the activism was a really important part of the Deep Ecology, and indeed Arnie Ness was himself an activist and was famous for chaining himself to the walls of a fjord in his native Norway to stop the damming of the fjord. And the platform of the Deep Ecology movement, which has 8 planks, the 8th plank says, if the preceding 7 planks haven't led you to action, then you didn't understand it, start again. Do you know? That so action is integral to Deep Ecology, and I think at least part of it is that when we are demonstrating, these are called demonstrations, when we are demonstrating, the main person that we're demonstrating to is ourselves. We're demonstrating to ourselves what we truly believe and where our commitment lies, and the fact that we're prepared to face, public disapproval or danger or even death. You know, it's to me, it's amazing that human beings seem willing to die by the millions in defense of one social fiction after another, countries and religions and ideas. And yet the idea that people are willing to go to jail for a year or two in defense of the earth itself, which is the source of all of these ideas and all of these social fictions, all of them come from the earth. And the fact that we're astounded that people will take risks and pay penalties to defend the earth, I think that that's another clue to the change in identity that's needed.
Yeah, we've fixed our identity to these external cognitive creations like the market system and nations and religions and so on. In fact, our real identity is with the earth. Look, it's a really interesting way of looking at things, because what you're saying is that the activism comes through as something that is in acknowledgement of the fact that we are demonstrating. But who are we demonstrating to? We're still demonstrating to ourselves. And ultimately, we need to live with ourselves. I take your point also that, all kinds of awareness campaigns, all kinds of appeals to governments, they've not worked. And really, this is going to have to be, I think a lot of people listening really do realise this is going to have to be a change happening at the consciousness level. And in the absence of anything else, I feel that reconnecting with nature makes the most sense, even if it feels so alien, and yet it is our original state. You know, that is who we are. I
guess the other thing I'd like to say here is that, yes, we're demonstrating to ourselves, but by doing so in a way, it's like we're demonstrating how seriously we take this thing to other people. And so, you know, Arnie Ness said that a sense of responsibility is a treacherous basis for conservation. And by that he meant that to feel responsible for something means that it's the other. It's like altruism, alter, the other.
Yeah.
That nature
that
is other than our very self. And so the separation is codified in that. And so if we're looking at a leg in the road and a vehicle is about to run over that leg, if we are a good person and compassionate and empathetic, we may rush out to pull that leg out from before the vehicle. But if we look down and suddenly realise that it's our own leg, we just haven't recognised that it's part of ourselves, then you don't have to be a good person anymore. Mere self-interest, which all of us are pretty good at, it's just that we don't recognise who we are. The self that we're trying to maximise for is a social fiction. The self disconnected from nature, it doesn't exist. 10 minutes without a breath and you're dead. You know, there is no such thing as this self that we've constructed. And so trying to maximize for that self is utterly futile. And so to be going into action from that space attempts to communicate something deeper than the particular aims of stopping that coal ship or something. So, you know, I was arrested for swimming out in the path of the coal ship, and I just love the thought of getting arrested for swimming in Australia. Do you know? And of course, there's no way that a swimmer is going to stop a coal ship. And so what's being demonstrated by someone attempting to swim in front of a coal ship, knowing that the police are going to arrest you before you get anywhere close, you know? And it's my own, I guess another moment in my own awakening was when I was living in London back in the early 70s. I was a systems engineer for IBM. I was coming home every night desperately unhappy and getting stoned and watching the news. And I saw the news item
what a combination.
I saw a news item where Greenpeace was in these inflatables was trying to catch 44-gallon drums of nuclear waste that were being dropped from a Dutch ship that was dumping nuclear waste in the sea. And I was like, they're crazy. If they were able to get in place, which they appear sincerely to be trying to do, they would be killed by that drum falling on them. What are they on about? And something happened to me watching that, which exploded in me years later at Terania Creek when finally I understood what they were doing.
Yeah. And what is that? When you say that it's not what is it demonstrating when you as a swimmer, is in front of a barge? What is it demonstrating? What is it doing?
It's showing a level of concern and a level of commitment that you can't really show merely by writing an article or by signing a petition.
Yeah.
It's showing a level of concern that anyway, it communicated itself to me and kind of awoke a similar concern in me many years later.
It demonstrates embodied concern. The embodiment is really important in those gestures. I agree with you. There's a range of practices that you have worked with for many decades that get people into this zone. So I'm wondering if you could just do one of the simpler ones with us. I think it's a breathing exercise. You don't have to sort of talk us through fully, but if you could just explain how it works.
Sure, I will. But if anybody listening is in a position to open a window or move to a place where there is a living plant within line of sight. So open a window and look out at a tree or a blade of grass, or if you've got a pot plant in the house or something like that, move so that you're looking at it while I tell you about this.
I haven't got one in the room, so I'm going to have to imagine it.
That's right. Yeah, and that's right. And if you don't, then imagine it. And so this process is based on I was talking about the emergent properties that have led to where we are. And one of those took place about 3 billion years ago when our ancestors were single-celled organisms floating in the ocean, bacteria, and had become so successful growing and dividing that all of the available nutrients had been consumed and were parts of our bodies. We were so numerous that no more free lunch. And that crisis was solved by the emergence of a new molecule, chlorophyll, which allowed us to capture photons of light from the sun and use the energy to break into a molecule that had previously been inaccessible, CO2, and extract the carbon to make our bodies. However, a consequence of this was that every time this transaction took place, a molecule of oxygen was released, and that was a toxic poison to the anaerobic life of that time. For more than 1,000 million years, that was unable to wreak any havoc because there was so much iron dissolved in the ocean that the moment the oxygen was released, it oxidized an atom of iron and a molecule of rust, ferrous oxide, fell to the ocean floor. And all of the iron that we mine, the iron ore that we mine, the banded iron formations 2.5 kilometres thick, the way that they accumulated, there's no scientific controversy about this anymore. That accumulated during that billion years, one molecule at a time, as a result of this action of photosynthesis by our ancestors. However, about 2 billion years ago, all of the iron had been swept clean from the oceans, and the next emergent property solved that crisis when the heme molecule emerged, which was to become the hemoglobin protein that carries oxygen through all animal bodies. And some of our ancestors began to learn how to utilize oxygen by breathing it in. And that ancient cycle of partnership between those that inhale oxygen and exhale CO2, and those who exhale oxygen and inhale CO2, the plants and the animals, including us, that has been ongoing ever since, and we need each other. Neither would be able to survive without the other. And so the process which we do in our workshops, and which I do a lot in my life in order to integrate, in order to align when I'm feeling lost or confused, to remind myself I can find a single blade of grass growing out of the cement if I'm lost in the city, and stop for 2 or 3 minutes and exchange gases, where I'm just looking at that blade of grass and remembering this ancient story that this oxygen that I'm breathing is being produced by this plant and its fellows, and the CO2 that I'm exhaling, in spite of the bad rap that it's received in recent years, and rightly so, because we're producing much too much of it. But in spite of that, it has a very honourable history. And so I just add consciousness to the exchange of gases. I add consciousness to the exchange of gases because it's going on all the time, whether I'm conscious or not. And I can only say it always fixes me right up.
Yeah, grounds you and gets you into a space that Oliver Burkeman calls cosmic insignificance. We are both part of something incredibly large, and yet we're only a speck in it all. And it reminds me of another exercise you do, which anybody who's listening, they can read your work or go to one of your workshops, but it sort of works around the idea of somebody asking, who am I? And it's a process, I understand, where you sort of show just, I guess it demonstrates our cosmic insignificance, that we're the latest link in a chain stretching back almost 14 billion years, and that our humanness is just the most recent stage of our existence. So humanness is just the tiny little speck in the chain of our existence. It's the most recent expression. And when we think of it that way, I think it really plants us back into life pretty fully.
So it's interesting because we're simultaneously this tiny little speck, insignificant, and at the same time, we're like, one of my teachers is the late Thomas Berry, and people can look him up, but he said that it's not just that we live in this extraordinary universe that empiricism has revealed to us, this developing universe, this evolving universe. The Big Bang is in creative mode right now in this conversation between us at every moment. It's not just that we live in such a cosmos, in such a universe, but that we are that moment when the universe has become conscious in the human, has become conscious of itself. And it's like James Lovelock said, that when we were able to turn a camera from space back and look at the Earth as a whole for the first time, this was the Earth becoming aware of itself. We are that part of the Earth that's conscious, and we are part of the Earth. And so when we experience ourselves that way, then it's like the universe looking over its shoulder and recognizing the trail that it has trod for 13.7 billion years, and it's the jaw of the universe that drops in utter stunned astonishment to recognize itself, so that we are simultaneously the universe, in some fractal sense, every piece of the universe is the universe, and we are just this one grain of sand in the vastness of it all.
And to appreciate that this andness, is actually a really good technique to understand this new way of thinking, I feel. It's this and it's this. We're both insignificant and we're also so vital for the universe to reveal itself to itself. We're both destructive and yet we're also creators. And we need to sort of, accept the two truths. John, I've got one last question before I ask my final question. So this is a penultimate question. I imagine that you come across quite a few people that feel a little bit of resistance to this way of thinking and to the kinds of language that's required to get this message across. As you say, it's really it's where the woo-woo meets kind of tangible science in many ways. But a lot of people do have a fear of going into this realm because it feels alien to anyone who's lived the last 250 years or so, and very few of us have a sense of the sacred. Rituals often sound to people like they're going to ask something of them. It's going to demand something that they can't provide. What do you say to people like that who are a little resistant? And I often find it is men. It's men who find it very difficult to come to this kind of space.
Yes, and so I've noticed that men used to be less than 20% of the participants in my workshops, and over 40 years, it's now more like 35 or 40%. So that's kind of an interesting observation. And I'm afraid I don't really have much that I have to say to people, as you know, that you describe, because this work depends entirely upon intention. That what I learned from Joanna Macy was that whenever a group of people gathers together in a circle with the shared intention to heal that illusion of separation, the earth never pushed us away. Whatever separation exists is all coming from our side. And so whenever the intention is there, the earth comes rushing back in, and that is the experience that we have of upliftment and empowerment and vision. Whenever I've accepted an invitation to do this work and the intention wasn't there because I've been asked to do it at a school where the pupils were obliged to be in the class, or in a workplace where the boss wanted us to be here and I'm just going to have to sit through it and, oh, give me a break, then not only doesn't it work for that person, but it doesn't work for anybody, because it basically requires the community to be aligned. And so I wish I had a solution that would, answer. But I've been noticing that more and more people, and people from different walks of life, are gravitating towards this, and that it's becoming easier for people, even though they're accountants the rest of their life, they can still relate, And maybe I'll just mention that the metaphor that I find the most useful for this is the Bradley method. Two sisters named Bradley in Sydney some decades ago created a method for regenerating native bush. And what they found was that you don't need heroic tree planting efforts. All you need to do is to recognize the natives and recognize the exotics from the moment the seedlings appear out of the ground. And the process consists of removing the exotics without treading on the natives. But the proviso, and the reason I mention it in this context, is that the area that you're managing in this way, you want to start where the erosion gully is breaking your heart, but if you start there, you're going to fail. What you have to do is to start where the greatest expression of natural intelligence is emerging, and work back from there, slowly removing the exotics, watching the natives, and all of a sudden, the pioneer species have created a microclimate so that the climax species are starting to appear. Did a bird drop the seed? Has it been waiting 100 years? We don't know. But you're backing away, and 10 years later, you look and you realize you're almost stumbling into the erosion gully, and by that time, the native intelligence of the place is able to take that in its stride.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what we're working with.
I like that metaphor. So what you're saying is, when we're working with people, we start where people are receptive and open to aligning themselves with this truth once more, and then it gets contagious. And it's a bit like what Meg Wheatley says in terms of those islands of congruence and islands of sanity. We create that, it becomes an attractive entity for people as they start to ask deeper questions of themselves, which I think more and more people are doing today. I like that. That works very well for me. Thank you. I like that answer. John, the last question I ask guests in this particular series of Wild is, how do you cope? I've got a bit of a sense of what your answer might be, because you've touched on it a few times already, but how do you keep yourself feeling beautifully, congruently human at this time in history?
Well, I'm going to give a different answer, because the answer that is contained in everything we've talked about, yes, that. But on top of that, I'm a member of a community, an intentional community, the Narara Eco Village, where there are at the moment probably 200 of us living on this land, and probably going to double in the next few years before the project is full. And my role, one of my roles in the community, is that I'm like the compost tragic. There are 40 green bins that get delivered to the bin area full of all of the green waste from the village, and I dumpster dive the green bins and make sure nothing compostable leaves the place, and I make compost heap after compost heap. And all I do, I never turn the compost, I just add chicken manure and then leave it. And because it's not turned, it takes 2 years to turn into soil. But once the project was 2 years old, there's always compost available, do you know? And so for me to be constantly taking this dead vegetation and turning it back into soil, turning it back into fertility, but to a larger degree being part of a village of people who are trying to build an island of sanity. What I'd love to do is, if it's okay with you, to send you a link for the show notes with a piece that I've helped to construct, that I initiated, which is called Features of Narara Eco Village, where friends and I put together 80 different facets of our lives here, and that just give a sense of just how splendid it is to have left the isolation of suburban living without, I'm probably the only hippie in the place, you know. I mean, there may be one or two people who'll argue with me, but maybe I'm the only hippie in the place. And yet there's a tremendous feeling of community that's growing here. And there are many, many things like this going on. And I feel like, you know, that's a huge part of of what holds me and allows me to be who I am.
Composting is a great sort of representation of what you're talking about, being in it with your sleeves rolled up. Please do send that link, because I think that it comes up a lot. People are wanting to know what these kinds of communities could look like, and in fact already look like, and to sort of see the kind of people who live there and how they're going about stuff. That'd be wonderful. So yes, I'll put that in the show notes, anyone listening. John C., that was a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your work. You've explained a lot of the missing bits in this conversation super, super well.
Thank you so much, Sarah.